I'm Daniel Ziblatt. Thank you so much for joining us this afternoon. Really great pleasure to be with all of you and to have a really exciting panel that we've put together for today. This is part of our series at the Center for European Studies, Democracy, Past, Present, and Future. And we've been doing this now. This is our second year of running this series, and this is one of the great benefits of the Zoom age is that we can hold this series, which really is co-sponsored actually by a whole range of institutions around the world, including the Berlin Social Science Center, the WZB in Berlin, the Central European University Democracy Institute, Collegium Civitas in Poland, and the Johns Hopkins University SNF Agora Institute. And so this is really a multi-sited seminar. Today, we're speaking to you. I'm in Boston. Jagor is in Boston. And I guess Kim, I'm not sure, Kim, you're in
New Jersey.
New Jersey. Okay, but I know our audience is from Europe as well as the United States and perhaps elsewhere. So really very excited to have all of you here. And we're here to talk about an absolutely critical topic that is really, couldn't be more timely. Unfortunately, with a topic like this, it's been timely for several years. But in any case, we've put really an outstanding panel together, and so I'm really quite excited to hear the speakers' comments, and then we'll open it up for comments. And I should say that this is a webinar, so each of our speakers are going to speak, and then we will and we ask people if they have questions to put questions in the Q&A tab of the webinar, and then I'll be kind of looking over the questions and asking the questions as they come up through the Q&A, and look forward to the discussion. So let me though first introduce our speakers. So our seminar today is Authoritarianism from Above and Below in East Central Europe. We have two speakers. That our first speaker is Kim Lane-Shepela, who is a professor, Lawrence Rockefeller Professor of Sociology and International Affairs at Princeton University. And is really a really experienced hand at these topics of the state of democracy and authoritarianism in Eastern Europe, in particular in Hungary. And I really can think of no better person to talk about these issues. When I have questions about what's going on in the world, I always, either contact Kim directly or look up at things that she's written. And she's really an expert and has been following the region and these issues of constitutional development since the collapse of communism, and has spent a lot of time living in Hungary, in Russia, and really and brings to bear on these questions the perspective of both a sociologist and a lawyer, and so has a unique perspective on all these things. So she's very accomplished, author of many articles, member of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, and so I could go on and on about her biography, but in any case, let it be known that she's a leading scholar of these issues. So very, very happy to have her with us. Our second speaker then, so after Kim speaks for a bit, then we will hand things over to Grzegorz Eckert, who is a professor, the Lawrence Tisch Professor of Government at Harvard University, and also the director of the Center for European Studies. We see a picture of the Center for European Studies, I think, or at least I do. Maybe some of you see on the webinar screen today. Grzegorz, many of you perhaps know as well, is a leading scholar of Eastern Europe and of democratization. His research interests have focused on Eastern Europe, civil society, and other parts of Asia as well. And he's the author and co-editor of many volumes, including most recently Ruling by Other Means, State-Mobilized Movements, along with Elizabeth Perry at Cambridge University Press in 2020. Editor of an important book on capitalism and democracy in Central and Eastern Europe, as well as author of several books on civil society in Eastern Europe, and always a relevant commentator on current events in Poland and in Eastern Europe. So today we have both of these excellent scholars here to talk about, to bring to bear their knowledge of scholarship onto really pressing political issues of the day. And so each is going to speak for about 20-25 minutes, and we'll begin with Kim, and the floor is yours, Kim.
Great, thank you so much. And I'm going to share some slides. I think that actually, good. If Grzegorz' microphone is on, we might get a feedback loop. So I think we're okay. Anyway, delighted to be here. Thank you so much for the invitation. I wish we could meet in person, but then we wouldn't have this audience from all over. So I'm delighted to be talking to you. Not so delighted about our topic, which is, as I show here, European democracy in crisis. So what's the state we can see of democracy in the world? And by the way, I have very fast slides and I'm happy to share them. So they're going to go by really quickly. And if you want a refresher, just contact me and let me know. So in the current state of democracy, the answer is it's not good. And what we're seeing is that a number of countries that have been uh, broadly labeled as democratic are now moving in an autocratic direction to the point where in the last decade or so, the percentage of the world's population living in autocracies has really increased by a lot. And it would help to figure out, so who are those autocratizing countries? And this is from Freedom House data. It turns out that the leading to autocratizing countries, the countries that have fallen the farthest, the fastest in the last decade, are Poland and Hungary. And both in the EU, and that's why we're here to sort of think about the fate of European democracy. Poland has been sliding from being a consolidated democracy to being what's called an electoral democracy, which is to say they have elections, but they're not completely free and fair. They don't have all the preconditions to make elections really fully, robustly democratic. Hungary, which started as an electoral democracy, is now an electoral autocracy or hybrid regime, or basically a government in which the people cannot necessarily change their leaders when and if they want to. So not a democracy anymore. So this will tell you that this is also a broader phenomenon. So this is from the Varieties of Democracy. They publish an annual report. This was their 2020 report. And what this shows you is it plots their sort of liberal democracy scores, which include a number of things like commitments to rights, separation of powers, free and fair elections, and so on. It plots the score along the horizontal axis that the country got in 2009, and it plots the same score, along the vertical axis that the country got in 2019. What that means is that if a country didn't change, it's on the line. If it got better, it's above the line. And if it got worse, it's below the line. And how much farther it is away from the line shows you how big the changes were. And so what you see here, Hungary and Poland, far away from the line, which is to say they changed a lot in the last 10 years. But you'll notice a number of other EU states are in this mix. Czech Republic, actually Slovenia should probably be on this map as well. Croatia, Bulgaria, Romania, there are a number of EU member states that have gone backwards when it comes to measuring liberal democracy. Now, our views about how democracy works were very much shaped in the 1990s at this moment of, shall we say, democratic exuberance, after the Berlin Wall came down, after Southern Europe and then Latin America and then Eastern Europe made these transitions to democracy, and the number of democratic countries was going up by leaps and bounds. Al Stepan and Juan Lins, in some of their very influential work, developed the idea of a consolidated democracy in which democracy as a set of institutions, rules, and patterned incentives had become the only game in town, to the point where you didn't have to worry about democratic breakdown anymore. The thought was that if a country became a consolidated democracy, that was it, game over, and that you would stay that way forever. And I think what we've now seen is that Lins and Stepan were wrong about consolidated democracies. But part of the case I want to make today is that they're wrong, but they weren't completely wrong. And the ways in which they were not completely wrong are actually quite interesting. So what we're seeing, as represented by all those EU member states, which had to have been at least, on the way to consolidation, if not already consolidated democracies, at the time they were admitted to the EU, a lot of them are falling backwards, which is to say consolidated democracies are failing. But, and this is the interesting part, they're only failing in reality and not in theory, by which I mean they're failing on all these scores if you objectively sort of measure, the robust indicators that a constitutional democracy is in good shape. But constitutional democracy still remains the only game in town as a public face that states want to put forward. And so as democracies are deconsolidating, they disguise this. They don't want to appear to fail. And they often come forward with all this rhetoric about why they're really democracies and robust democracies and proper democracies. After all, right? So liberal democracy is failing in reality, but not in theory. Instead, what we're seeing is the rise of what I call a bunch of legalistic autocrats who are creating a kind of veneer of legality, creating an attractive public face, or so they say, while they're steadily removing checks on executive power, which is what deconsolidates the democracy in practice. So what I'm going to talk about in my remaining minutes today is a is to first of all ask, like, so how are democracies failing in Europe? And the answer is that, the old-fashioned way, like you're overcome by a coup, is not what's happening anymore. And instead, what you see is this progressive legal deconsolidation of constitutional democratic states. Constitutional democracy is being undermined by law. Free and fair elections are being undermined by law. And then the question is, so why is that happening? And this is where Grzegorz and I are probably going to disagree. Some of that may be a difference between Poland, his primary case, and Hungary, my primary case. But I also think it's a difference in perspective. So the standard explanation is the people are demanding, the populist people have gone crazy and they're demanding this kind of change. And the other explanation, which I'm going to try to convince you of, is that actually what we're seeing is an institutional crisis, that political parties are really falling apart and that there's a top-down deconsolidation. So if some want to blame the bottom-up approach, wants to blame the people, others of us want to work top-down and blame the elites. And then I'll say a little bit about what can be done. All right, so how is democracy failing? This is actually not just European data, but it's the Varieties of Democracy data, a recent paper by Anna Lerman and Stefan Lindberg. Look at over the last 100 plus years how it is that executive power changes. This was a project in which they were coding great leaps in power in the executive, sort of unconstrained executive power. And what's striking is that in their first wave here, which is the first half of the 20th century, what you see is that by and large, it would take either major legal change or illegal activity to bring more executive power into a constitutional framework. In the Cold War period, which is the second bar, you see a lot more coups. Made sense. A lot of those were proxy wars between the Soviet Union and the United States. But here's the part that's really interesting, this last third pillar here, in which the vast majority of great leaps in executive power are by the great leaps in seizure of power by the executive is accomplished through law. And in particular, legal access that didn't require formal legal changes, as well as what they call minor extensions and major extensions. But the number of sort of illegal power grabs in countries that are seeing great rises in executive power is really going down compared to the prior periods. Now, diving into this, what I've done is to call this phenomenon the development of what I call the Frankenstate. And that is because what you're seeing are legal changes fundamentally altering the character of constitutional democratic systems. And I call it the Frankenstate, obviously, relying on the metaphor of Frankenstein. And, as the graphic reminds you, Frankenstein was the name of the doctor, not the monster. What does the doctor do? The doctor digs up a bunch of formally normal bodies and stitches them together with an arm from one and a torso from another and a leg from another. And that's the metaphor for thinking about how it is that these new legalistic autocrats are crashing constitutional democratic states. They take essentially body parts from different, bodies, different public bodies, I suppose, and mix them together in a legal system where they have this effect of creating a monster. So what you're seeing now is the creation of these new constitutional tools, or a sort of toolkit of worst practices that's in circulation, that is being adopted by one autocratic regime after another, into and out of Europe, by the way. So Europe's a major site for the invention of this, but it's also a major site for borrowing stuff in from other countries. And when these tools work together, they start to deconstruct constitutional democracy. So just to give you a couple of examples, this one's very familiar to everyone who's followed Hungary and Poland. The Hungarians realized that one of the ways they could capture the courts in 2011 was to lower the judicial retirement age. The rationale was to kick out of office everybody who had their legal education during the communist time. Looked like a perfectly reasonable rationale. But because Hungary and Poland and most continental legal systems have civil service judiciaries, lowering the judicial retirement age has the effect of lopping off the leadership layer of the courts. The European Commission brought an infringement action. The European Court of Justice expedited it and said, no, you can't do this because it's age discrimination. But even with an expedited procedure, Hungary had already fired all the judges and most of them didn't come back. So it was Orban's way of capturing the judicial system, the ordinary courts. Um, this looked very attractive. So Poland copied the same thing, even though the Court of Justice had already said, no, you can't do this. And so they lowered the judicial retirement ages for ordinary judges in 2017 and for the Supreme Court in 2018. Here, the European Union was able to intervene more quickly and actually to prevent the wholesale firing of judges. And this was the beginning of a jurisprudence now of the ECJ about judicial independence, which has been pretty important. But the crucial thing I think to note here is that this is it was trying to hide behind law, capturing the courts. If the government had gone in, with the police and simply raided the offices and thrown all the judges out onto the streets, it might have been more apparent what they were doing. But when you do these changes through law, it makes it a little harder to figure out what's going on. In this case, however, Poland got caught. Hungary got away with it. Another thing, capturing constitutional courts. So we all know, and this is actually a cartoon from Franklin Roosevelt's effort to pack the Supreme Court, packing courts is not a good thing. So actually, Turkey invented, Mr. Erdogan, Turkey invented in 2010 a way to pack a court while disabling critics. And so how to do that? Well, first, what you do is you take your constitutional court and you greatly expand its jurisdiction by making thousands of new cases go to this court, small human rights cases that won't rock a regime, but that will make the outside world think, aha, you're trying to protect human rights. And then after those thousands of cases get to the court, you say, if you're Mr. Erdogan, oh, I'm such a defender of this court, I need to put more judges on it. And so when he did that, there were a lot of people defending his action because it looked like he was actually expanding the human rights jurisdiction of the court and then providing more judges to actually make the decisions. So he got away with it. The next year, Viktor Orban did the same thing, expanded the jurisdiction of the Constitutional Court, said it needed more judges, put more judges onto the court. No one's challenged this at all. 2015, Mr. Kaczynski comes along and decides to pack the Constitutional Court. Well, he didn't learn completely from the Hungarian and Turkish examples. He just tries to shove illegal judges onto the court. That generates an alarm bell because that's the kind of thing, stands out as a power grab. So Poland again gets into trouble. Had they copied the Hungarian and Turkish method, where you just expand the jurisdiction of the court, give it more cases, then expand the number of judges, I bet Poland would have gotten away with it. So you see that these tools are in circulation, and what they rely on is disguising the autocratic move for their success. They rely on disguising the autocratic move in something that looks like, a human rights measure. So what you see, and again, this is writing a book on this, so I'll just short circuit the discussion of a lot of other examples by saying we're seeing now in a lot of these deconsolidating democracies a kind of script where these leaders that are deconsolidating democracies are elected, often free and fair elections the first time. They then proceed to engage in major legal change, but what's supposed to happen after elections, right? You elect a new government to change something. So it doesn't look that suspicious until you recognize that many of the legal moves are aimed at removing constraints on the executive. That's the signature here. There's usually then an attack on the judiciary, media, and NGOs, sequentially or all at once. And the point is to make them politically dependent by law. There's putting loyalists into key positions. So anything that can go after your enemies and buffer your own people, the prosecutor of the election office, tax authorities, audit office, the selection authority for judges, those become targets where having friendly people put into all those positions makes a lot of sense. Rewriting strategic laws, rewriting the election laws, laws regulating civil society, the media, the judiciary, and then engaging in not just opposing the political opposition, but trying to delegitimate it. And that's a script that we're seeing in country after country after country. That said, autocrats still want to be seen as human rights respecting Democrats. I love this little picture of Mr. Orban on the pink sofa, or this truck that got, sent all over Europe to deliver Polish goods around the EU, after Poland had been attacked for actually looking like it was engaged in, official Holocaust denial. Respect us, during World War II, Poles saved over 100,000 Jews, plastered on trucks going around Europe. So that's why I say that what we're seeing is that democracies are being deconsolidated by law. But the people doing it still want to appear warm and friendly and democratic and rights respecting to the outside world. So democracy is failing in reality, but not in theory. So then the question is, how are they doing it? They're doing it with lots of lawyers. So it's not tanks in the streets, it's phalanxes of lawyers, and the appearance of democracy matters in all of these changes. What happens, how do publics not notice what's going on? Part of what you see is that the governments doing this are also engaged in massive amounts of distraction. So in Hungary, the government kept putting up statues to raving anti-Semites from the 1930s, culminating in this monstrosity of a memorial, which was the memorial for victims of the German occupation. That means the one during World War II, the one where Hungary was voluntarily signing up to fight on the same side as Nazi Germany. What occupation are you talking about? So this was a controversial memorial that attracted a lot of opposition attention and demonstrations. At the same time that the opposition is racing over to kind of protest the memorial, the government is shoveling all this legislation through the parliament when no one's there to notice. In Poland, when the peace government came to power, they reopened the investigation into this plane crash in Smolensk in 2010 that killed the then Polish president and many state officials. There had been an investigation that was concluded. They reopened it. And while the Polish government was doing some of its most offensive stuff right at the beginning, they were distracting a lot of attention by saying, look over there, plane crash, right? So this is how governments get away with it. So if that's how it happens, then the question is why it's happening. And the standard explanation is you walk into any bookstore and you'll see, a bunch of books of this kind. The standard explanation is populism. And so the usual explanation is that the people put these leaders there. So what do you expect? And the people are therefore to blame. And something has gone wrong with the people. Either there are people left behind by economic dislocation, people swimming in a sea of fake news, people who are afraid of immigrants or terrorism or whatever else, the loss of their way of life. They're angry at elites, they're racist against those who are different, or they have always been backward, unenlightened, and uneducated. You see these tropes throughout the literature on populism. And you see charts like this. Populism is growing in Europe, and you see maps of this kind. Of course, the problem is that what counts as populism is, in contention because there's no standard agreed upon definition. The reason why Hungary appears as so populist on this map is that actually they weren't coding Fidesz, the dominant party. They were coding Jobbik, which is a more extreme party than Fidesz. So, anyway, it's very hard to measure these things across cultures. But, I think that what might be more relevant is sort of looking at individual attitudes. And so here's where I think we get a clue into why is this happening. So this is the result of a Pew Global Attitude Survey. I picked 2016 because that was the year Donald Trump won the US presidency. And what you see is that on a question about whether, having people of different kinds all mixed together makes the country better or doesn't make a difference or makes it a worse place to live. In the year that Trump was elected, Americans are saying 58% diversity is a good thing. And what you see is in many European countries, of course, the percentage thinks that countries are made worse off by diversity. It's much bigger. But, Hungary and Poland, which are going to be the two countries that are the biggest backsliding countries, are not the worst. But there certainly are populist attitudes if populism is defined the way my colleague Jan Werner Müller defines it, as something that is opposed to kind of pluralism in general. So that might be one measure of like how populist publics are. But in the Pew survey the next year, a different question was asked, which is, would you support a system in which a strong leader could govern without interference from parliament or the courts? That's the thing I think of when I think of democratic deconsolidation. And here what you find is that there's very little support for that anywhere, right? Including in the countries that have much larger percentages of the public, supporting anti-diversity measures. Okay, now, and here's the surprising thing. Of course, the U.S. is way more autocratic than it is populist by this measure, so we can discuss. But this is the Center for European Studies. So let's look at some of the European countries, and here too, the countries that strike you as being the most fragile, in the sense of having larger percentages actually being, thinking that a strong leader would be a good thing, are not the countries that immediately come to mind as the ones that are engaged in the worst form of democratic deconsolidation. We can debate the UK. So, but what this tells me is that support for populism in the sense of, diversity does not imply support for constitutional destruction, right? These two kinds of views come apart. So when voters are voting for populists, assuming that's why they're voting for the leaders they elect, they get autocrats, but that may not be what they voted for, right? I think we make a mistake to think that everything voters get is what they wanted to get. And so we have to consider, so what were voters voting for? What were the choices that they had? And what exactly did they think they were voting for? So let me just do a little dive into Hungary, since that's my main case. And I know that Szegers will talk more about Poland. If you look at 2010, which was the year Viktor Orban came to power and started this rapid slide into autocracy, this was the result of the Pew Global Attitude Survey that year. And Hungarians were asked and people in the region were asked, are you satisfied with democracy? Right? And the answer was no, no, overwhelmingly no. 77% say I am not satisfied with democracy. To which I want to say, like, what sane Hungarian would not be discontent with democracy in 2010? Hungary had been hit very hard by the financial crisis in 2008. It functionally went bankrupt. The IMF came in and bailed it out and had pushed aside the elected government. Hungary was one of those countries governed by a caretaker government under a harsh austerity budget. Who would think that was good? I'm wondering who the 21% are who thought democracy was in good shape, right? So this is but in that same survey, they ask also about these more sort of constitutional values. How important how important is it to have a fair judiciary, multi-party elections, free media, etc.? These are the percentages in that same survey that said these things were very important, like not just important, right, but very important. And in that set of countries where Hungary wound up most discontent with democracy, Hungary is ahead of the other states that were polled in that year in terms of its commitment to basic constitutional democratic principles. So again, these things come apart. So what did Orban's election mean in 2010? Well, you read Orban's speeches, and he was campaigning against austerity. He was campaigning against the evident corruption of the prior regime. He never said during the campaign that he would rewrite the constitution or seize power forever. And he had been prime minister once before. It was in a coalition government, but he's conservative, but the republic survived. No real threats to the constitutional system from his earlier time in power. And if you look at what the voters' choices were, the choice was between Orban and his Fidesz political party, between the socialists, who had bankrupted the country on their watch, so they were obviously not going to do well. There was a tiny new, vaguely green, vaguely youthful, and mostly vague party called Lehet Mások Politika, which means politics can be different, and nobody knew who they were or what they stood for. And then there were the neo-Nazis. So if you had a choice between a center-right conservative government that didn't look dangerous, the socialists, somebody you didn't know, and the neo-Nazis, the fact that Fidesz got the vote it did was at least as much a function of the choices that were offered to the public as it was to, positive support. He looked safe. But now this is in Hungarian, so I'm sorry, but what you want to look at is the orange line, and the scale on the right is the percentage of the public supporting Fidesz, the political party, in orange. So Orban has never had a majority support. He's like Trump in that regard, never polled a majority. At the time of his election in 2010, of Orban's election, Fidesz was polling at 45%. And as soon as Orban's constitutional designs became clear, as soon as it became clear he was going to rewrite the constitution and try to crash the system, his popularity sank like a stone as soon as it became evident, to the point that when the Constitution went into effect, the new Constitution that he wrote, his party's popularity was below 20%, which is to say, when autocracy became visible, the Hungarian public was not for it. So then how come its popularity increases? Because he starts social welfare programs, starts giving out energy subsidies, workfare, and so on. The usual strategy of buying votes. He wins again in 2014 and again starts a series of autocratic moves, and his popularity drops. So everything we know about Hungarian public opinion tells you that, yeah, the public may be in favor of certain forms of populist governing, but they're not in favor of constitutional destruction. And so, you know, even now, that will, so 6 years into Orban's term, Hungarians were asked, like, how strongly do you support democratic principles? And here too, overwhelmingly, honest elections, gender equality, free speech, freedom of religion, all of these get overwhelming majorities at the same time that Orban's undermining them. So I just don't think that he's playing to the crowd, so to speak. Here is a survey from 2019 in which of all the European countries that were surveyed, Hungarians come out 87% say it is very important to have honest, regular, and competitive elections. Okay. So what happens? Well, elections are rigged in Hungary, but they're not rigged in the old-fashioned way of stuffing ballot boxes or bribing voters or having violence at the polls. Instead, it's this autocracy by law, right? And so what we see is election law rigging. It's all done infrastructurally. I've written a long paper about exactly how the rules made the Fidesz victories absolutely inevitable, and they still do, by the way. But all of that is infrastructural. It's hard to see if you're not a lawyer. So they change the rules to benefit incumbents. They make it hard for the opposite side's voters to vote. They've captured the election administration, all that stuff which is infrastructural and not so visible on the surface. And so what we saw was, this was the map here reflects the 2018 vote. Viktor Orban got 46% of the domestic vote, and that's the orange again, are all the districts he won with 46% of the vote. 49% here includes all the Hungarians from abroad who got to vote. In 2014, he won 88% of the single districts with 45% of the vote. That's what rule rigging does. And so are the people to blame? I don't think so. It turns out that it's really hard for anybody to dislodge Orban now. So I want to just say something about, like, now what, right? So why is this happening? And the answer is, and I'm eager to hear Daniel's views on this because I learned a lot from his work on parties. What we see everywhere is that parties are in decline in democratic societies, is that parties are in decline. On the left, you see in that brown line the number of parties that get more than 1% of the vote. In the blue line, the share of the vote received by the winning party. You see party systems fragmenting. And on the right, you see a diagram that shows you the change in the share of the votes won by the two main parties, which has just been steadily declining. Parties are not trusted. So here's Eurobarometer data in Hungary. In 2018, 72% say they don't trust political parties. In Poland, it's 75%. So parties are not good vehicles for mobilizing democratic will. Why is this? Well, I won't go through the whole slide here, but just to say that what you're seeing are lots of internal fights, failure to rotate leadership, party drift, and failure to deliver on promises. And so I think what you're seeing is that states can get rogue leaders without having rogue voters. By rogue voters, I mean voters that want to crash constitutional democracy. And this is because the parties are cracking up. They're failing at gatekeeping. So you sometimes get dangerous candidates that will attempt autocratization, but it looks like a normal political party. And people are trying to vote for the best of a bad set of choices. So if party systems are broken, then you get these crazy results. And why is that happening? Well, this is a little chart taken from Pippa Norris and Ron Inglehart's work. I think what we're seeing is that in countries where there has been a traditional left-right party split, the left-right dimension of politics is diminishing in salience. And what's emerging instead is a different axis that goes from what's called here populism to cosmopolitanism, what I might say is nationalism to cosmopolitanism, where parties of the left are riven by these splits between the nationalists and the cosmopolitans, and ditto with parties of the right. It's cracking up these traditional parties and weakening them. And that's something that's happening in a lot of different places at once. And so what we're seeing is that party collapse, party weakness, party failure to screen candidates and perform their gatekeeping functions is what's putting these choices to voters. And you see voters kind of, throwing the bums out at every election as long as they can, rotating around trying to find a party that will work, and they're not finding it. So what is to be done? And I'll close here. Elections need to offer better choices and better vetted choices to voters, obviously. I don't think that the problem is, if the problem is not with the voters and the problem is with the structures, we got to work on the structures, and we need better parties. So how do we get better parties? Well, in this regard, I've been very influenced by the work of Peter Mayer, who traces the history of European party systems and shows how they went from being sort of rooted in social groups in what we would now call civil society, and they've since become much more like public entities. But they're neither one nor the other at this stage. And it seems to me that we need to think through how to make parties more stable, because they are crucial to the continued existence of constitutional democracy. So they either need to be further regulated if they're really public entities, or they need to be re-embedded in deeper social ties if they're going to be private ones. But as long as they're in this interstitial space, they can fall apart, go rogue, and do all the things that we've seen them doing. So my view here is that we need to study political parties, to think about how to strengthen them, to think about how to keep them from disintegrating and failing at their gatekeeping functions. There's an interesting move on the table now that we're talking about Europe, where the European Commission just this week actually proposed some new rules regulating Euro parties. And so one of the things I'm wondering is whether in the European space in particular, we can actually start enforcing the regulations that are currently on the books. Because, for example, European regulations require that parties themselves adhere to certain democratic principles, but this is simply not being enforced. We could enforce that starting now. But, right now the Commission's not thinking about it. As usual, they're solving an existing problem by not using existing law, but by proposing new laws. So I think we might be able to put some pressure on the Commission to start enforcing the rules they have. So this is where I want to stop. Voters can't vote for democracy if it's not on the ballot, or if the rules are rigged. And not having options on the ballot and rigging the rules is an elite problem rather than a popular problem. And I'll stop there. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Kim. I would like to turn the floor now over to Grzegorz. And let me just remind the audience that we have this question and answer function. And so please feel free to put questions as they occur to you in the question and answer function. And when we get to the end, we'll be opening it up and I'll be going through some of those questions. So the floor is yours now, Grzegorz. Thank you.
Okay, great. Thank you so much. Let me say at the beginning that I really admire Kim's work, and I agree with almost everything she said, but we have a difference of opinion, and I think that I will be able in the next few minutes to tell you why do I see things a little bit differently. Now, the explanation which Kim proposes for what's going on in the region and why do we have this backsliding in the construction of democracy belongs to the supply side tradition in explaining politics. And here you see a couple of ideas which were advanced to try to understand why there is this move back or authoritarian drift in the region. Some of the arguments are emphasizing neoliberal economic reforms as a main culprit. Krastev and Holmes thinks about imitation of the West as an issue. Kim already mentioned that there is a lot of discussion about populist parties and emergence of nationalist parties, and of course Kim's argument about autocratic legalism. The three previous views have relatively weak empirical support. As Sherry Berman recently mentioned, they tell a convincing story on the macro level, but they really do not have support on the micro level. I think the story of globalization destroying industries and changing living conditions in cities and old industrial centers is very convincing. But when you start asking voters why did they vote for Trump, they will tell you that they are against abortion, they are against gay people, they are against, try to support religion and so on and so on. So there is kind of disjunction between the stories we tell about the sources of authoritarianism and the way in which real voters vote in the real situation. So here is my argument, which is a complementary view to the story which Kim just presented. Now, if democracy is being murdered by cynical politicians and clever lawyers, there is a lot of accomplices to this crime. And the question I'm asking is, first of all, why ethno-nationalist parties were able to gain parliamentary majorities in the first place? And then why there is a persistent support for those parties, despite outraged both at home and in Europe about their policies and their ways of dismantling the democratic system. Now, when you take a look at support for political parties in Poland, after 5 years of gigantic street demonstrations, after banning abortion, after dismantling really constitutional tribunal, after persistent attack on the legal system, after scandal one after another, huge corruption scandals, taking over state companies, illegal payments, you name it. I think it's really hard to imagine a worse PR the party can get in the 5-year period. But still, this is the strongest party in Poland with the biggest support of all parties in Poland. And I think what I see from public opinion polls in Hungary, it's pretty much the same situation. The upper line is Fidesz. So perhaps, at the beginning in 2010, some people were confused about what Orban and Fidesz are going to do. But today they know pretty well, right, what is going on. And I don't see any significant drop in the support for Fidesz. So there is something else going on here. And I will try to really talk a little bit more about the story. So here is the argument, and I took it straight from a very distinguished Polish journalist who, a couple of months ago in the weekly Polityka said the following thing. Poland's problem is not that we have this specific government building a mafia state a la Corleone, authorizing corruption and impunity, but that this government has and is able to secure parliamentary majority. And then he tells the story about how clever Jarosław Kaczyński was, that he discovered that substantial part of the Polish electorate does not care about liberal democracy, does not care about capitalism, pluralism, freedom, liberties. They think that these are Western imports. And Kaczynski built the power of his political party on this idea. Now, so I think we cannot say that what's going on in Poland, Hungary, and some other countries in Central Europe is a problem with the voters, but it's a problem with the subset of voters. And that subset of voters has persistent authoritarian preferences. And I will use, paradoxically, a similar data, even the same public opinion polls as Kim used, just to make the opposite argument. But why we are not seeing that kind of simple argument on the table? Besides the fact that blaming the voters is a sentiment which we all have, but I think there are two other reasons for it. So first of all, we don't tend to take the voters' preferences, the expressed preferences, seriously. We very often try to, prescribe some much deeper structural causes to the way people behave in politics. Very often assume that they have false conscience and their vote are confused. They want other things but vote differently and so on. I think this is the view which is not absolutely correct. And the second thing, we very often assume that there are significant shifts in preferences. So we say, all right, so everything was pretty okay in Eastern Europe for the first 15 years of transition, and then the financial crisis came, and that changed the preferences of voters in quite dramatic way. We say, globalization was relatively okay for a certain period of time, but at a certain point reached the tipping point, and then people started to rebel against globalization. Now, I think that it may be true on the margin that there are those shifts depending on the reaction to some political crisis, but Brodel reminds us that that mentalities and values change very slowly, when we look at the public opinion polls in the region, we clearly see that the right-wing political parties, those parties which are in power in Hungary and Poland, with all their ideas which are on the full display, with the rabid nationalism, with homophobia, racism, religious fundamentalism, those parties resonate, and those claims resonate with significant part of the electorate. So let me briefly show you a couple of empirical illustration. I'm not going to really delve into it. This is not very systematic. I treat this as vignettes, just showing that there is a certain group of preferences and certain types of views which are deeply embedded in the region. Now, there is a lot of research on authoritarianism, on preference for authoritarianism. I'm going to focus only on that dimension. So by and large, people are making claims about this preference by looking at the number of things. Lots of research looks at the skepticism toward representative institutions and liberal freedoms, support for plebiscitarian policies, and so on. So we are asking voters, potential voters, respondents, what do they think about democracy? Is democracy the best political system, etc., etc. Another set of ideas is about political participation and the low electoral participation as a sign of authoritarian preference. Then we have a famous set of research on authoritarian personality, which really emphasizes, a number of traits, psychological traits, which are common among people who are supporting authoritarian politics. I'm aware of big discussions about this, of course, and how controversial some of those views are. But as a set of psychological predisposition, this is something which we may still think about. Now, the next way of looking at the basis of authoritarianism is to look at the characteristics of local communities. And of course, we have two famous examples of Edward Banfield's research on the small Italian town, which he described the situation in this place as amoral familism. We also have Ernest Gellner idea of the tyranny of cousins. Two more things, secularization, arrested secularization, which may be a sign of the authoritarian preference. And then there is some research on political hysteria and anxiety about identity. So let me illustrate each of those with some, very, very fragmented empirical vignettes. So first, support for democracy, the rule of law, low trust in political institutions, low level of participation, and low support for liberal values. This is the set of ideas which indicates a more preference for some sort of authoritarian rule. Now, here is the same Pew survey Kim quoted when people were, well, a set of questions were kind of put together as an index, whether people are willing to consider non-democratic options and how committed they are to democracy. And as you see from this graph, that Poland and Hungary are at the very bottom of this index of countries committed to democracy. You know, when you ask the question about whether specific sets of organizations are important for their country, and here is an example of two of those, human rights organizations and opposition political parties, you notice that less than a half of people in Poland think that oppositional parties should operate freely. Of course, you know, the differences are not huge between the countries, but there is a tendency that, the new members of the European states, the East European countries, have lower scores on those questions. They're a bit higher in case of Hungary, but strikingly low in case of Poland. When it comes to participation, you know, just only look at the EU accession referendum here in the first two columns. In Hungary, only 45% of people bother to participate in the accession referendum, and 83% voted for it. That means that more than half of the Hungarian population can be, you know, interpreted as being against or oblivious to the EU accession. The same story in Poland, even more dramatic, because not only you know, the vote for referendum was much lower than it was in Hungary. And when it comes to trust of different institutions, you see that that the most critical institutions for democracy, political parties, media, and parliaments have the lowest trust when polls are asked about what kind of institutions they trust. A couple of indicators for the authoritarian personality ideas. You know, the research on it emphasizes order, patriarchy, respect for tradition, conservative values, ethno-nationalism, and so on. And again, a couple of examples. This is from the Polish survey, where people were asked what kind of changes in the penal code they would support. So, for example, 64% of Poles would support the establishment of labor camps. You know, if people could vote freely on things like death penalty, Poland would have death penalty back at this time. And a couple of other issues of this kind of traditional views. Again, the question from Pew survey, whether women should have the same rights as men. Only 69% of Poles believe that this should be the case. Some other East European countries have even lower scores. Hungary is a little bit higher on that. But again, you know, this is well below the median for Europe. Homosexuality, should homosexuals be accepted by society? You know, it's pretty much the same story. And here, Poland and Hungary are very close. Almost half of the population does not think that homosexuals should be accepted by society. And another question about abortion. And as you see, all the yellow bars are from countries of the former Soviet Union and Eastern Europe, and majorities in those countries are against making abortion legal. Now, when it comes to another dimension, those segmentary communities I mentioned and amoral familism, low levels of social support, again, you can bring a lot of data to support that. Now, this is the question asked in Poland. Do you think that people can be trusted? So as you see in the last, 20 years, the number of people who think that people should not be trusted is very high, above 70%, and it doesn't change. It recently even went up a little bit. The same story with whom do you trust, right? So the first bar in this graph is the family, the close family. And the third bar is the distance family. So as you see, family are the only circles of people. Majority has no problem of trusting. All the others, of course, should not be trusted. Okay, let me skip this because we are running out of time. Now, the story of secularization, I think this is a very interesting aspect of what's going on in the region. You see that in Poland, almost 80%, over 80% of population still practice religion and believes in God. And that number changed only slightly over the last 30 years. You could even say that the number of people who participate in more engaged way by taking communion has been rising. So that may mean that there is more fundamentalist attitude in the way in which religion is practiced. And this is the story across Eastern Europe. It's not the Polish story. It's easy to tell, with John Pope and Polish Church that this is specifically Polish story, but it is not. Religion is very important for people in many other East European countries and in Southern Europe as well. Now, this has some political consequences, and I think here is one example of it. These are the seminarians in Poland who were polled before the EU parliamentary elections, and 62% of those seminarians, the future priests, voted for peace, and another 24% voted for parties which are even more radical than peace and more nationalistic than peace. So church story in this mix is very important one. Now, about political hysteria and anxiety about cultural identity. This is a quotation from István Bibó, a great Hungarian social scientist. I will not read it, but I can, of course, send them the slideshow to anyone who is interested in it. Now, when people were asked about whether they think that immigration will destroy their culture, 73% of Czechs thought so, and 68% of Slovaks, and 65% of Hungarians. Poles are a little bit more relaxed about this, but because this is a bigger country, but still almost half of the population thinks that this is a serious problem. Relation to refugees, again, this is the research from 2015. Now it probably is much, much worse after what happened on the Polish border for the last several weeks. But in 2015, already 69% of young people between 18 and 24 thought that taking refugees is not a good idea. At the same time, there is a question about how people think about themselves, right? So, the Pew question: our people are not perfect, but our culture is superior. And as you see here, 55% of Poles think that the Polish culture is superior, and 66% of Romanians and 69% of Bulgarians and 85% of Georgians, and so on. You know, this is a very interesting aspect of anxiety about identity and problems with identity. Now, the last piece of empirical evidence is about the gap between West and East. And this gap between Western preferences and Eastern preferences is pretty much the same over the last 30 years, despite EU membership, despite you know, modernization of a certain kind. So, for example, if people are asked whether they would accept a Muslim as the member of their family, only 27% of East Europeans would do so, vis-a-vis 66% of West Europeans. Just one more huge difference: favor legal same-sex marriage. Only 16% of East Europeans would do that, vis-a-vis 75% of West Europeans. So, what are the sources of it? This is a persistent a set of preferences which are anti-liberal, anti-democratic, pro-authoritarian, can be interpreted that way. There are a couple of explanations on the table. I think one of those refers back to the idea of civic tradition and social capital, and it includes both pre-communist and communist legacies. Another one is about the peculiarities of communist modernization. Those countries experienced profound modernization, but this modernization did not have liberal effects the way modernization had in Western Europe. Grigopop LHS from Princeton had this wonderful piece showing why expansion of education and expansion of urbanization didn't produce liberalizing effects. We can discuss that in the question period. But another puzzle is that there was no secularization in Eastern Europe, despite the fact that communist governments supposed to be anti-religious and anti-church, not to mention the lack of any serious reconsideration of national histories, of historical legacies, of historical traumatic periods, and so on. So I tend to call the persistence of those authoritarian preferences the everyday authoritarianism, and that everyday authoritarianism really can be described in sort of several very simple ideas. So communism left behind only partially modernized society with deep attachment to religion, propensity for traditional values, the patriarchy, suspicion of pluralism, distrustful of state, and so on. These mentalities were not produced by the communist system, really, but they reflect much longer peripheral mentalities which people in that region had. What communists did, it only preserved those mentalities. In 1989, those societies faced multiple challenges, which we all know: transition to democracy, market, cultural modernization, and so on. And my argument is that at the beginning of the transition, it was not the situation that everyone in Eastern Europe became a liberal lover of democracy. For many significant groups in society, those challenges were very alien. They were all confused about what is the direction in which things are moving. And we could use here the Gerald Platt idea of sense-making crisis. So there's this confusion and this orientation during the initial years of transition. And then the traditionalist groups started to mobilize. And the most important role in these mobilizations is played by conservative churches, by emerging conservative civil society organization, which I described in some papers a couple of years ago. And then, of course, the populist political entrepreneurs like Jarosław Kaczyński, who turn those groups against liberal institutions, against liberal values, and against Europe. Now, those groups are the core electorates of PiS and Fidesz, and these are the true believers. These are not people who really vote for instrumental reasons. These are people who are voting their deep held views and their values. These are people, there is this very interesting research in Poland done on it. These are people who are very often better off economically, who are very satisfied with their lives in economic dimensions, but have a very traditional, very conservative views. How big is that group? And this is going to be the last point I'm going to make. So this group is approximately between 20, 25, 30% of the eligible voters. Here we see that those eligible percentage of eligible voters for Fidesz and PiS in various elections. Now, here this 2010 elections, which Kim described, maybe this outlier a little bit because of the confusion. But after that, everyone exactly knew what Kaczynski and Orban were up to, but that electorate still stays, between 20 and 30%. And, what is most interesting is that it's relatively stable over the years, right? So when you look at the percentage of votes which blocks, not specific parties, because the parties were changing during that period, but populist bloc and liberal bloc are getting, two things should be said, that this percentage is relatively similar over time for both blocs, and that percentage of support for liberal bloc is higher than the percentage of support for populist and authoritarian bloc. So to end on the optimistic note, I would say that pro-liberal constituencies still have the fighting chance to take power away from authoritarians, both in Poland and in Hungary. But they must unite, and this is the first condition, and Hungarians are a little better on this than Poles. And they have to hope that the next elections are going to be free and full. And if pressed, I would really be very hesitant to say that there will be that way. Thank you very much.
Great. Thank you very much, Grzegorz and Kim, to both of you for really outstanding presentations. And we see here what appear to be two very different perspectives. But so Kim's arguing that there is not a majority of authoritarians in this region of the world, and Grzegorz, and this is a function of political actions and political failings of elites. And Grzegorz has highlighted much more the bottom-up forces at work and the deep historical legacies. I'm tempted to kind of probe that argument a bit more, but I want that we have 12 questions here in the question and answer, and so I'm going to refer to those. But I would just make one point that perhaps the arguments are not as incompatible as they might at first appear, because at some level, what Grzegorz has identified as 20 to 30% of the electorate who firmly hold to these views, and that's clearly not a majority. And so the question is, how does a political party like, let's say, Fidesz generate these super majorities? It's expanding its base beyond that, and also through these manipulations. And also, I guess I would also add, looking at opinion data in the United States, going back to the 1920s and 30s, the earliest opinion poll data, this is about the same segment of the electorate that supported Henry Ford for president in the United States in the 1920s, that thought that Joseph McCarthy was outstanding, that supported George Wallace. And so, this may be a commonality. I mean, so I guess one interesting issue would be to what degree is this electorate and these dynamics that Grzegorz has identified, I think very convincingly, are these features of the post-communist world, or is this in fact a uniformity of democracies worldwide, perhaps, or at least let's say in Europe and the United States? I think that the kind of potential base of the AfD in Germany is around 20 to 30% as well. So I'm tempted to kind of throw that back at you guys and ask you to kind of work that out. But I think, the reason I'm going to, you could comment on that. But I want to draw upon some of the questions, because I think one thing that's certainly on everybody's mind, sort of moving forward, is the possibility of an opposition to all of this. And in particular in Hungary, I mean, I was just looking at opinion poll data in Hungary, because these elections are coming up next year, that this broad coalition, from the far right to the socialist left, have united. And this is clearly a necessary condition to ejecting Fidesz from power. But looking at the opinion poll data in the summer, things look quite promising. But there's this kind of fragmentation apparently taking place, and now Fidesz is leading in opinion polls over the opposition. So, and this echoes some of the questions that come up in the question and answer session. So I was wondering what both of you might think, and maybe start with Kim here. What are the vulnerabilities of this opposition? What are some pitfalls? What seems to be tearing it apart, or is it falling apart? Is the opposition falling apart? And if I remember correctly, you had said you were not entirely optimistic, and it sounded like Grzegorz as well, that this opposition can't hold itself together. And I think there are lessons in this for the United States, for instance, in the kind of anti-Trump opposition in the United States. I mean, this is a broad coalition from Liz Cheney all the way to AOC in the United States, and so this is holding this kind of coalition together is always difficult. So I'm wondering if you could both comment on the pitfalls, potentials. What are the things that are weakening this, and do you have any advice for a democratic opposition in both Hungary and in Poland? So maybe Kim, we could begin with you.
Yeah, so of course, not surprisingly, in light of the view I took in my general talk, I think a lot of this has to do with rules and structures and not just attitudes, right? So, and in fact, I was thinking actually, Daniel, about, you mentioned this in How Democracies Die, that there's this kind of persistent 30% in a lot of democratic countries of people who don't think so highly of democracy itself. So the question is, what are the rules and structures through which that gets translated into, an election victory for someone? And what you see is that overwhelmingly systems that have disproportionality in their election system are by far more vulnerable than the ones that have proportional representation, right? So this is also the issue in Hungary, that their election system should have produced something more like a proportional representative system. It was always disproportionate. They designed the system in the 1990s to put its thumb on the scale of the largest party, because they were expecting a huge fragmentation. And that election law stayed in place as Hungary functionally became a 2 or a 2.5 or a 3-party system. So there was a mismatch between the election rules and the distribution of opinion in the public. And Orban made it worse with his election law reform, so that the only way the opposition can win is if they all work together. And they've finally gotten together and figured out a way to do that. But the election is a long way off. There are a lot of wedge issues that Orban can use to try to split this coalition up. And I wouldn't, and in past elections, we've even had buying off of candidates and parties and things of that kind. So that's why it's not clear that public opinion is what carries elections in Hungary anymore. Everything has to get mediated through these institutional structures, which are maladapted for the purpose. And so that's why I think we also have this problem in the US. First past the post systems are wildly disproportionate, and you multiply that with the electoral college and it gets worse. So it seems to me that I think it's not that we shouldn't focus on what publics are demanding and what a third of them might be willing to do if you allow them to do it. But we also have to think about what are the structures that actually allow actual majorities to govern. And in all these systems that are falling apart, you typically have some kind of disproportionality in the system that gives that 1/3 that's kind of persistently underneath even functional democratic systems a larger weight in the system. So I'm back to rules and structures. Not that we should ignore public opinion, but public opinion isn't always what wins elections by itself.
And I want to hand it over to Grzegorz in a moment, but what can given those rules I mean, what can keep the coalition together? It has to be I mean, I take the point entirely that, so given those rules, it has to be a particularly broad coalition,
Right.
which seems it's inherently vulnerable to infighting and disagreements.
Right.
What are those infights and disagreements in Hungary today, and how can they, how can they be avoided?
Yeah. So what the opposition did that was really smart in Hungary was to have this primary system. And one of the questions in the Q&A box is like, so what can oppositions do? Well, one thing they can do is stop fighting among themselves and try to aim the fight, at where the real enemy is, which are the enemies of democracy itself. And that's also, I think, a lesson for the U.S. and everywhere else. You have to focus not on the aspects of the governing party that actually do have majority support. I mean, governments in Eastern Europe are conservative governments. The left of a East European government is to the right of the center of other European politics, right? But all these governments were robust democracies in the 90s, right? Being conservative doesn't prevent you from having a democratic government, right? So the focus of these oppositions has to be on overcoming the dictatorship, right? Overcoming these autocratic elements of the system. And if the opposition can focus on that, they can stay together. Of course, what's going to happen is that the government is going to try to pull everybody toward the more extreme versions of populist ideology, right? That's the strategy of the government. So Orban is going to ramp up LGBT fights. He's going to ramp up a fake fight with the EU over money. He's going to accuse the opposition. Like, there's currently a scandal going on in Hungary about how the opposition was trying to auction off City Hall in Budapest. They just made it up, right? And it's a big issue. So, I mean, truth is no longer a constraint in politics, which really makes it very difficult for these oppositions to stick together. But if they focus on overcoming the dictatorship, that's what's going to hold them together. And whether they can or not really depends. There's also one other wild card here, which is that the Orban government made it very easy to form new political parties. So even though the opposition parties have all gotten together and they're going to run one candidate against the Fidesz candidate in every one of the single member districts, I'm sure there are going to be 7 parties by the time we get to the election. And they're all going to have names that look kind of like the parties that are in the coalition. That's what they've done before. There's going to be a whole bunch of that kind of nonsense, which is going to try to distract people from this really, binary choice. Like, do we have a democracy or do we have an autocracy? And the opposition's got its hands full, making the case that autocracy is the true enemy here.
Great, thank you. Thank you. Zhegors, do you have thoughts on this kind of opposition strategies in the face of both these large segments of the electorate, but then also these institutions which exaggerate the importance of those segments of the electorate?
I fully agree with Kim that this is a question of rules and how the system is structured and so on. Orban was in much happier situation because he had this constitutional majority, so could easily rewrite everything in the way which suited his interest and gave him this hold on power, which it's very difficult to dislodge. Now, the Polish situation is a bit different because Kaczynski never had the constitutional majority, so he had to move in a very anarchic way, trying to violate the constitution along the way and breaking the law and doing a lot of things which were not really legal. So the recipe is simple. The first thing, the opposition needs to unite. That's without the united opposition, both PiS and Fidesz will stay in power. Now, it is very difficult to do this because opposition in those 2 countries range from fascists to radical communists. They sort of, hold the nose and try to get together, but this is very difficult, very difficult to do. Now, the second thing which is important is that those countries are highly polarized. And I think, the movable part of the electorate is very small. People have very well entrenched positions, which will be very difficult to dislodge. That is why I think it is so important that there is this segment of the population which gives the 30% of solid support for the authoritarian parties, because that's really electorate which no one is going to take away from them. So opposition and the ruling parties, at least in Poland, are fighting for few percentage point of the electorate which can be persuaded to change sides. But what worries me the most, really, is that there won't be free and fair election in Poland. And we saw already the prelude to this. When the presidential elections came a couple of years ago, during the pandemic, PiS sensed the opportunity to win that election an easy way and decided to organize election via post office, which was against the Polish constitution, against the electoral law, not electoral commission supposed to, can't vote, but the post office. PiS spent millions preparing this, printing ballots and so on, completely illegal action. And in the last moment, this idea failed. But, this tells me that they will not hesitate to do something similar to be able to stay in power in the coming elections in 2 years, right? So I think, opposition needs to unite. That's out of the question. They have to do that if there is any chance for anything. But how things developed after that, it's a completely different story. Not to mention what's going to happen after the election. Even if opposition wins, they will have a couple of votes in the parliament more than Orban or Kaczynski. And then we'll see, how this will play out.
So I think one does see an analog in the US. I mean, from my view, with all of the discussions around critical race theory, in effect, what these, and you hear some never Trump Republicans now saying, well, now that we've defeated Trump, the biggest threat is from the illiberal left. And so we need to focus on this. And I kind of see that this is a kind of parallel problem where it's dividing this broad coalition. And the problem is exacerbated by institutions that require a huge majority to win, because it's just simply harder to hold together such a heterogeneous coalition. We only have a few minutes left, so I would like to then ask you both to reflect on, we are at the Center for European Studies, what role is there for the EU in all of this? I mean, I understand that, Fidesz has now was about to be dropped from EPP, and then he pulled out of the EPP. He sort of, you can't fire me, I quit, the kind of story. And so, in principle, this gives, for instance, the EU greater leverage, and there seems to be more noise about cutting off funds and so on. I mean, is this kind of harder line by the EU? I don't know if you would accept the characterization as fully a harder line, but certainly a harder line in the past. And pressure on Poland with regards to judges. So is this the right way to go? I mean, what are the domestic political this certainly makes Europeans feel better that they're doing something, the European Union and West Europeans. But how does this play in Hungary and Poland? Does this actually aid the incumbents, or does this undercut them? What's the right thing for the European Union to be doing? Maybe Kim, we could start with you again.
Yeah, so such a good question. So, one thing that you see over and over again, we're using a lot of survey data, and what we've seen is that it depends on how you ask questions and what you ask. But when questions are asked about, is it a good thing for us to be part of the EU? Hungarians and Poles are at the top of the list in Europe, overwhelmingly the most support for the EU that you would find anywhere. So that tells me there's a deep reserve of support for the EU. And that if anything, I worry that support for the EU will go down if the EU doesn't stand behind actual democratic government. So you're seeing a rise in support, even in Hungary now, for cutting off of funds to the Fidesz government, because everyone can see how corrupt it is, and they see the misspending of funds. There's even support, I think, for more legal action to try to shore up the independence of the judiciary, which has taken another big hit, in this year in Hungary, and so on. So I'm not worried that the EU is going to lose its support in these countries. I think the EU may lose its support if it doesn't act. So then what should it do? Well, it's making a lot of noise, but it's had very little effect in Hungary. It's had a little bit more of an effect in Poland because the second time around, they knew what they were dealing with, so they acted more quickly. And also, quite frankly, when Franz Timmermans was in charge of this portfolio, he was much more aggressive. Right now, we have a commission that is incredibly passive. So I think it needs to actually do things, do things. They have plenty, they can bring infringement actions, they can cut funds. They have no shortage of tools, they don't use them. And now what you see is conversation emanating from Brussels that we can't do anything now because it's before the election, because the Hungarian government has already said they're trying to influence the election. Okay, but you cannot have these sanctions for violations of EU law depend on where you are in the electoral cycle. If you're violating EU law, you're violating EU law no matter where it is. So I have strongly urged all the European institutions to get, full speed ahead on trying to enforce European law in these places. And I think that if oppositions win, there's going to be a second issue, which is, in Hungary at least, it's not just that the election law is rigged. The entire system is rigged. So that if the opposition wins, they're confronting a packed constitutional court, packed judiciaries, packed prosecutor's office, everything is hardwired for Orban through the next election cycle. And so there may have to be some moves that look like they run counter to the rule of law at the beginning in order to be able to establish it long term. And that's where I'm trying to look beyond the next election to say, if the opposition can win, how can it govern? And how can the EU aid with that? And for that, stay tuned.
Yeah, and I guess that issue is one of the things dividing the opposition as they think about this. So, Grzegorz, we only have a couple minutes left here, but final thoughts on it. Oh, you're muted. You're muted.
So let me make three points. So first of all, finally, there is hard line coming from Brussels and Western Europe. And, the funds for Poland were already cut from the Norwegian funds, and they are not coming back, despite the fact that those local governments changed their homophobic views and laws. Yesterday we had, or even today, we had this first indication that the European Tribunal is going to rule that money for rule of law is, okay with treaties. So I think there will be real financial consequences for those two countries and potentially for some other countries as well. Now, two other points. For a long time, we thought that they will do a lot of silly things, but when it comes to real money, they want to have it. Now, it looks increasingly that Kaczynski government made their mind that they don't want EU money. I mean, they would like to have it if this would come without condition. But if they are that they can easily dispense with the EU funds for political reasons and staying in power and so on. So it is a very interesting situation that those sanctions at this point may not be really enough to change political behavior at least in Poland. And the final thing, which there is a lot of misunderstanding about this. Right? Because, when you look at the Eurostat data, they will tell you, 90% of Poles support European Union, and, the support is the highest in all the new member states, and so on and so on. Now, if you ask the question, is European Union good for your country? Probably 85% would say yes. But the Polish sociologists really split that question into like three questions, right? Is the EU good from the economic point of view? Are we benefiting? Are we benefiting from the political dimension? And are we benefiting in cultural dimension? So of course, when it comes to economy, 80% says yes, perfectly, we support EU giving us money. When it comes to politics, this drops dramatically by 30%. And when it comes to cultural values, it drops another 30%. And at this point, peace, of course, which knows that very well, says what's going on in the EU is the situation in which Germany is trying to build the Fourth Reich. That's the latest argument, and it's directed to those Polish audiences, which have a lot of anti-German prejudices of various kinds. And this is designed really to further destroy the credibility of the European Union and sort of force the Polish electorate to start being much more critical and toward the EU.
I think we are out of time, but Kim, I'll give you final word.
One quick thing, which is, I think Grzegorz is right about this, because of course, one thing that happens is the more these autocratic regimes are dug in, the more their propaganda floods the entire public space. And then what the EU is changes. Yeah. So, the longer this goes on, the less hope you have for pulling it back, because then you do generate a public that, is just acting on the basis of false facts, and then you're stuck in a vicious circle.
Yeah,
I think less optimistic note.
Yeah, so yeah, no, but I understand the point, and I think the analog that sometimes people make between the U.S. South within the U.S. Federation is being similar and in a similar way, I think the entire American political system was affected by that. One final question from Ruxandra Paul, which I'm not going to ask you guys to comment on, but just she asked a question which I thought was quite interesting, which is, sort of as a ray of light, because, we have to end on some kind of optimistic note. Can one imagine Fidesz without Viktor Orban? Is there a generational problem that these type of parties face that may be a kind of vulnerability of these parties looking forward? Of course, if they regain, power in 2022 and in future elections, that problem will not be as severe, but that's a kind of another angle to think about how these parties, how populist parties, they're so personalistic, how they regenerate themselves over time. But I think we'll end it there, because I don't want to push our audience beyond the hour here, and our great speakers who've given us so much to think about. Thank you both, Grzegorz and Kim, really fascinating discussion. And thank you, the audience, for your attendance. And stay tuned. Next semester, we'll be having more events, and look forward to hearing all of your comments and potentially seeing all of you again. Thank you again, Kim and Grzegorz.
Thank you.